Hello and welcome to the Six L's podcast. My name's Mike Nicholson from Six L's. Today I'm going to be speaking to Laurie Meakin, the CEO of The Others and Me and author of the book No More Menemies. Firstly, before we get started, a big thank you to Lumen Research, the sponsor of this podcast. Lumen Research are an eye-tracking technology company that are expanding our understanding of human attention and enabling brands to plan, buy, optimize and measure according to real human attention. So thanks very much to Lumen Research. And Laurie, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me. I'm really happy to be here.
Thank you very much for coming. I very much appreciate it. So traditionally, we start off by taking a little trip down memory lane as it relates to your career. So perhaps you could give us a bit of an idea on what you've been doing and what you're doing now at The Others and Me, please.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've had quite a long and varied career. Interestingly, what I'm doing now brings together kind of elements of all of it. So I started off as a teacher. I never quite meant to be a teacher. I meant to go into law, and I almost did a couple of times. Studied jurisprudence at uni, hated it and left, almost went back to study law again. But that sense of like, how do we make the world work a bit better is something that's always kind of driven me. And that's what I wanted to do in law, but then, and family law in particular. So then I was a teacher teaching English, media studies, cultural studies, because I've always been fascinated by how do we understand each other and how do we empathize, how do we walk around in others' shoes and just learn a bit more about who we are by learning a bit more about who other people are. Then I decided to go into advertising, kind of slightly on a bit of a whim, I'll tell you. I obviously presented it to the people who were interviewing me as a very strategic decision, but it just always fascinated me. So I did that, became a strategist. And since then, I've sort of moved around a little bit into management consultancy, brand consultancy, worked inside media organizations. So I worked at the BBC for a while. Founded or co-founded an agency that I very happily, absolutely love building with my co-founders for a decade. And it's only in the last couple of years that I decided to take the next leap, which is to leave that place and go and scratch the itch that I'd been building for a while, which is to try and understand something really important, hence the book. And then I built a consultancy off the back of that to use what I'd learned.
Okay, fabulous. So I loved the title of your book, No More Menemies. Just for those listening, I woke up at 5 o'clock one morning, quite bleary-eyed, looked at LinkedIn as I always do. That's basically where I live. Professionally, I'm not a weirdo. Well, I am, but that's where I live professionally. And Karen Stacy, a mutual contact of ours, had shared one of your posts, and your name was familiar to me. I wasn't entirely sure why at the time, but I read your post and I thought it was really inspirational, and I really loved the idea of trying to reduce the adversarial nature of almost gender wars. Sometimes it's almost us against them and vice versa. And so can you give us a bit of an understanding? And for those that are watching rather than listening, this is the book, No More Menemies. I will be... and full transparency, literally last week, I met Laurie for the first time and we spoke for the first time on Monday, and it's now Thursday. So I haven't read the book yet, but I have researched it. So hopefully my questions will make sense. So just full disclosure on that one. So could you give us a bit of an idea on how long it took you to write it, what the research process looked like? I've got a little bit of experience in that, writing a book, and the research process sometimes is almost the longest bit because there's just so much to unpack. Why you decided to write it in the first place, what that research process looked like, and why you thought it was an important thing to do.
Yeah. So I'm glad you like the title. It felt like I really wanted to try and kind of get something that almost emotionally as well as rationally just hits at that thing that a lot of us are feeling, even if we don't articulate it, which is, call it culture wars, call it gender wars, call it zero-sum game thinking, whatever you like. But this sense that men and women are locked in some kind of battle for supremacy. And if one is winning, the other must necessarily be losing. And that it's a difficult situation for everybody. And that, interestingly as well, it's quite a high stakes game. So a lot of the time, there's a lot of anger, there's a lot of fear, there's a lot of frustration. And I wanted to really explore that because I've known for a long time, I love understanding things starting from data. I think lived experience And qual research are really, really useful, but I love having kind of real data as well and going, what am I missing? Where are my blind spots? What does the picture actually look like? So I'd been asking myself a question quite a few times, which I'll be honest with you, particularly amongst my kind of female friends, every so often I would go, bloody hell, the data is really clear, right? That gender equality benefits everybody. It carries real benefits to men in terms of mental health, physical health, economic success, happier relationships, better longevity, all kinds of it, even better sleep and better sex. It's like there's data coming out of our ears about gender equality genuinely benefits men as well as women. And yet there's a lot of data that shows that in some ways we're going backwards, and we can talk about that again in a sec, that there's a lot of stuff that's really harming men. So when we look at male suicide rates, male employment, how boys are doing at school, a whole of men's physical safety, etc., in a whole bunch of areas, it's not working for men either right now. So gender equality works for all of us. Right now, it's damaging all of us. And I was just like, why on earth is this happening? And one of the questions I'd forever ask myself, kind of rhetorically, when I was with the girls, was just like, why do men not just lean in? Why? And then after I'd asked it in exasperation a few times, I was just like, the strategist in me kind of kicked in and was like, well, why do they? It kind of doesn't make sense. But then we all know that smoking's not great for you, and a lot of people do that. And we know that eating 5 a day and going to the gym is good for you, but that doesn't mean we all do it. So I shouldn't be surprised. I shouldn't be surprised that a lot of the time we all go about doing things that aren't necessarily helping us. So I think what I thought, and it sounds a bit ridiculous to say it, but like the strategist in me who's worked in advertising, media, comms for years was like, if gender equality was like a brief, how would I answer it? And then once I'd started thinking that, I couldn't unthink it.
I love that.
So I was like, well, what I do is what I always do, which is to go, the only way to actually solve a problem is to genuinely understand the problem, not what we think the problem is, because often what we think it is not the same as what it actually is. And then put that to one side and go, who are the people who can help create change? Who are the people we want to affect? Who's our target audience effectively? And I was like, well, our target audience has to be men as well as women, because we can't create a more gender equal world if only half the world is trying to do that. It's just not possible. So and then I go, the principle I've always used in my work is the only way to really create change is to understand what people want, what motivates them, what they already care about. And then you kind of hack those two things together and go, right, how can we get our target audience, if you like, to get more of the stuff that they value, crave, love, solve the problems that they have in a way that helps us solve this business problem. So I was like, well, if gender equality is the equivalent of the business problem, or gender inequality, and if our target audience is men as well as women, what I need to do is two things. I need to go away and really understand the problem, and not just what I think it is based on my own lived experience and the conversation I have with other women largely. And I need to understand men and understand what motivates them in all kinds of ways, how much they understand, but really what drives them. Because what became really clear is most of the conversations the feminist movement has been having with or about men for years has been about telling men what they're doing wrong and how it needs to be better, identifying a system that's built to prioritize men and a male point of view. And it's not really been inviting men into the conversation and starting by going, well, what is it that men want and how do we motivate them to want to change, not just tell them that they should create change?
Okay. You mentioned a couple of times there that sometimes you think the problem is one thing, but it's actually another thing. What did you mean by that?
So, I mean, I know from all of the work that I've kind of always done, it's very easy to think that when we look at the world, we have to acknowledge that we're all partial, right? We're all biased, and we all have blind spots, and we're all likely to notice the things that confirm what we believe and not notice the things that we don't. There's also a whole bunch of stuff as I started kind of researching this that I've discovered is like that goes way deeper than I thought it did. So, for instance, the way that we understand our bodies, our attitudes, what we think is more valuable than other things, even how we judge exactly the same behavior when it's manifest in one person versus another. We are incredibly partial. And so really trying to understand not just what does a the world feel like to me through my gendered lens, but what does the kind of bigger data picture actually say? What's behavioral economists, academics, behavioral scientists, science, technology, what is all of that stuff telling us? So in the book, there's about 650 data points that I gathered from kind of publicly available data out there in the world. There's probably twice that much that's still sitting in kind of little files in my Google Docs. Because for me, really understanding that and not just looking for what I wanted the answers to be was really important.
It's definitely been my experience that people project their own lived experiences and thoughts and biases onto things that they see, read, hear. And so I obviously do it as well, but it's really hard to see it in yourself, right? Yeah. So how do we get better at understanding where our own biases are so we can understand other people's points of view more sort of clearly and fully? Yeah,
it's a really good question. I think part of it is just being aware of that and finding some kind of compelling, interesting examples that can just kind of make us stop and think. So there are a few, for instance, one of my faves that's an example I often use with people as a sort of a useful start point is to go, there is all kinds of data, loads of experiments that have been done that show that when we, and by we I mean women as well as men, see women doing something or who we believe to be a woman doing something, we will often value it less than when a man does it. And so there are experiments where there's a load of them. There's ones about books, there's ones about commentary, there's ones about football, there's some stuff about music. So I'll use the music as an example. So an orchestra, Boston Symphony, I think it is orchestra, were realised that there was something weird going on with their audition technique because they knew that when you look at kind of performance of people of different genders, generally, there is not a massive performance difference between boys and girls, men and women. But in terms of their auditions, they kept ending up over-indexing on men. And so someone at the university said, like, why is that happening? So they did some experiments where, first of all, they said, let's do blind auditions because then we won't be projecting onto it what we think that person's like. We'll just be listening. And still, it didn't make as much of a difference in the data as they'd expected based on a whole load of other data and evidence that they looked at. What they discovered was, what they then did was asked everyone who was auditioning not just to be invisible, but also to take off their shoes as they walked into the audition. When they did that, they ended up with a much more gender balanced set of people who'd made it through the audition. And that's because that they were so good, their hearing was so finely attuned, being musicians as well, that subliminally they were recognizing the difference between a man's footprint and a woman's footstep. And that was making them believe or mark the man's performance higher. And we see it in all kinds of things. So there's all kinds of evidence. The really interesting thing is women do it as well, for a start. So this is not me saying men judge women more harshly. We all do it because for centuries, for generations, we've been taught at a really fundamental level that there's a whole bunch of things in the world that men are better at. And interestingly, in the domestic sphere, it works exactly the other way around. So we will watch a man looking after a baby and presume that he's not as good at it. And because we presume he's not as good at it, we judge the exact same reality more harshly because, as we say, that bias doesn't just make us expect different things. It makes us read exactly the same data in a different way.
In a different way, yeah. So going back to the Boston Orchestra then, so was that because it was one of those jobs that had predominantly been done by men historically, and so people assumed wrongly that men would be better at it, and so they were subconsciously hearing those footsteps of a man and thinking he's probably going to be better.
Yeah, there's an amazing book by Mary Ann Sighart that I kind of summarise a fair bit of the learnings from within my book, No More Menemies. That's extraordinary. It's called The Authority Gap, and she is one of the world authorities on this particular phenomenon. But yeah, that is exactly what happens. It's so deep-rooted over generations and centuries that there are a bunch of things that we assume men are going to be better at. And we are so convinced that that's the case, partly that we assume that's the case, so we guess that will be the case. But it's so fundamental that we read exactly the same thing as if that were true because we're so... And virtuosity. So it's interesting, again, it will be quite complex sometimes. So things like creativity can sometimes, in some areas, be seen as quite feminine coded. But actually, when you get to a level of virtuosity, then it suddenly flips into masculine coded. So, for instance, the difference between a cook and a chef. A cook will be feminine coded, generally, because that operates within the domestic sphere. But as soon as you take it out of that domestic sphere and into the kind of virtuoso, the creative genius is often something that we tend to code as masculine. So it's relatively nuanced sometimes. But yeah, you're right.
One last question on the orchestra, if you know it. What was the gender split of the interviewer? So the people doing the judging on the performance.
It's an excellent question. And one of the bits, no data is ever complete, is it? And one of the things I find fascinating is that every bit of data that we look at raises as many questions as it answers as well. And as I said, a lot of this, it's done by women as well. So many of the data points that we look at don't gender disaggregate the data as much as you want them to. So, and interestingly, often they will, in this case, they're looking at gender as a question, but the studies that I have seen so far, and it may be if I go deeper, I might be able to find it, but it doesn't report the gender of the panel except to talk about mixed gender and that it's the same in all genders.
Okay. So would you expect the judgment of that performance to be different based on other data points that you have and other studies that you've seen? Would you expect a woman to judge a woman giving the interview? Yeah. If that's it feels a weird thing to say, an interview with an orchestra, but audition. Yeah. Thank you. That sounds much better, doesn't it? Would you expect the woman to judge more favourably another woman because they felt that the woman would need that because this is a male-dominated profession, and would you expect a man to perhaps more harshly judge her because of the same reason? Or would you think across both genders they would both have the same idea in their head that this is a male-dominated thing, so men are probably better?
It's a great question. So I think, first of all, if they're even asking that question, that's a helpful thing, because what most of the time happens is that no one's actually asking that question and we're not even aware that those biases exist. The other thing is all of the data that I talk about is like overlapping distribution. So it is not all men are like this and all women are like this. It's just if you're a man, you're more likely to behave in that way. And if you're a woman, you're more likely to behave in that way. And that's really important because one of the things I often get whenever I talk about any of this is that someone will say, yeah, but I know someone who's a bloke and he does this, or who's a woman. Yeah. And you're like, yes, overlapping distribution. That is always going to be the case. But what we do know generally is that when it comes to these kind of things, often women are more likely to be more aware, to judge more in a slightly less biased way. Now, again, I sound like I'm biased. I would say that, wouldn't I? But I think part of the reason for that is that women are generally the outgroup in most societies, have been patriarchal. There are a few matriarchal societies in the world, but not many. And when you're the outgroup, there's fascinating data that says you are better generally at understanding the full picture than you are when you're part of the in-group. So I, as a white girl, am much less good at understanding whiteness than a person of colour because I'm in it and I have to keep reminding myself of it. So that's going on. Women are just more attuned to some of this stuff than men, but it doesn't make it exclusive. So there's a couple of other data points I think that are quite interesting that show the picture can be a bit mixed. So one is about children and babies. So for instance, parents are much more likely to assume that their boy children, their sons, are cleverer than their daughters. They overestimate it on average by about 10 IQ points.
Both parents?
Yeah. So both parents are likely to do that. Men are more likely to overestimate their boys' intelligence than mums are to overestimate their boys' intelligence. But again, there's not enough evidence to be able to kind of really dive into those kind of variables. It's interesting to go, generally, men will tend to be even less aware of those kind of biases and to get things in that area wrong a little bit more often than women. But that, who knows why that is? It may be for a whole bunch of very complex things that we've not yet pulled apart. The other thing, in some areas, you see the data are a bit more extreme. So there's another bit of data that a lot of people I talk to find fascinating, which is a study done quite a long time ago, but there have been other studies that have found similar things in different ways, which is where a group of people talking, you know, there's like a myth, and a lot of women will say, yeah, this is how the world feels. Is it right? In this case, it is right. Men tend to dominate conversational space much more than women. Ironic, I've barely stopped talking, but in most of the situations, that's what tends to happen. And there was this there was this study done that looked at how much space people are actually taking up in a conversation, men and women, and how much space do they think they're taking up in that conversation. And what they discovered in that study is that the women were pretty good at guessing, estimating how much space people were taking up. The men were really bad at it in this study. And again, I think part of the reason for that is probably because public spaces have been taken up by men, for centuries, for generations. And we all judge things according to what feels like normal. And what's happening in public spaces now is that women are taking up a lot more space than they used to. And so for men, loss aversion is a very real thing. Men are much more likely to notice to overestimate how much space women are taking up, right? So what the data says in this thing is that when they asked how much space, conversational space, were women taking up, the men in that study thought that the women were dominating the conversation when they took up about 30% of the airtime. And the point at which they thought it felt about equal was when women took up 15% of the conversational space, right, which is kind of fascinating. Again, there's lots of reasons why that happens, but the answer, as ever, is not massively simple. So in some places, women are almost equally as likely to be prey to these kind of biases. In some areas, women are much more likely to see things more clearly as a more accurate reflection of reality. But I think the really important thing that I always come back to is it's not about men are judging women more harshly or women judging men more harshly. I think the really useful thing is to go, there are biases and blind spots that all of us deal with. And if we can all make an effort to try and understand that better, it would just be helpful for all of us.
Yeah. I was listening to the Jordan Peterson interview with Kathy Newman this week, re-listening to it. I thought it was a very good interview. And he talks about the personality trait of agreeableness and disagreeableness. Mm-hmm. And he said that at a general level, and obviously every human being is different, but at a general level, men tend to be less agreeable, mm-hmm, and women more agreeable. And so when we put that into a career context or into a boardroom and we're having a meeting, women are less likely to want to interrupt and put themselves forward, and disagreeable people are more likely to do that, yeah, and agreeable people less likely to do that. Yeah. And if it happens that women tend to have that more agreeable personality trait, which is not a negative, if anything, it's a positive, but yeah, in that setting, yeah, it's going to manifest differently, right? Would you agree with that?
Yeah, again, I wish the answer was like a really simple yes or no and things were really binary. It is always quite complex, but yes, that is the data definitely shows that women and girls are much more likely to over-index in those kind of qualities, in qualities of empathy, emotional intelligence, putting other people first, wondering about how everybody else is thinking and feeling. They're likely to interrupt less. They're likely to be more, worried about and concerned about and careful about how everybody else is feeling than men and boys are. As you say, there's a really interesting thing about that already, which kind of goes, as a society, we tend to undervalue those qualities. And it's, thank you as well for having such an open conversation. It's beautiful. But I think society has over the years tended to value masculine coded qualities more highly than feminine ones. And there's a whole bunch of data that does that. So you're right. Interestingly, that quality of the things that we talked about, emotional intelligence, being aware of other people, caring about how other people are feeling, making sure everyone else feels comfortable. There are huge positives in that a lot of studies show, particularly around the business context as well as relationships, men could really benefit from leaning into more of that. But as you say, also there are downsides to it. So if it's about not being able to assert yourself, that's really problematic. Now, the jury is still out as to how far that is nature versus nurture. There are some studies that show higher levels of estrogen tend to over-index with people having more nurturing, emotionally empathetic kind of qualities. Testosterone is more likely to over-index with more kind of combative, confrontational approaches, etc., and aggression. Some studies kind of question what's chicken and what's egg in that situation. But I think the really important thing is the way we nurture and socialize boys and girls is fundamentally different. So society takes a lot of time teaching girls to do all those things that we just talked about and teaching boys to do the opposite. Still now, and I would have thought that things had changed quite a lot, but when, again, you look at the data and see what's going on, there's a brilliant Lego study that looks at masculine and feminine coded toys, and it makes it really clear that parents, again, doesn't split out the gender, but it says it happens for all parents, they're much happier encouraging their girls to play with masculine coded toys than they are to encourage their boys to play with feminine coded toys. So like even now we're teaching girls that they can be assertive and confident and do all of that stuff and be empathetic, etc. We're still tending to keep the kind of range of emotions and behaviours and attributes that we expect in boys a bit narrower. But then what also happens as well is, which is I think another thing to really layer onto this, so there's a bit of biology, there's a lot of social conditioning, but then there's the what happens to people and how do you get rewarded and how does society treat you as a result of that. So again, fascinatingly, when women in the workforce, they're expected to be more compliant, to make other people feel comfortable and feel happy. That's how we code women and girls. When women do that, there's this weird double bind that happens. And this is particularly exacerbated for women of colour. So women are kind of penalised for not being assertive enough. And often we overread how unassertive they are. So there's a myth that women don't ask for pay rises. Actually, a lot of data says that's not true. They tend not to get them as often, but they ask for them just as often. There's other studies that say women actually tend to display a lot more confidence than people think they do. They don't suffer imposter syndrome at any higher rate than men. It's just we talk about it and we notice it more. But what also definitely happens is that when women do display more confident, assertive qualities, back to as we were just talking about before, we read those very differently. So a woman will be seen to be being aggressive or assertive or a bit of a ball breaker or a bit of a harridan, or if she does things that in men we read as assertive or charismatic or whatever. So again, there's very complex balance of nature, nurture, and our sort of reward structures and how people respond to things that are all impacting on a lot of this.
Yeah. So if we take it back to our industry and the structure of our companies within the industry, the brilliant Karen Stacy is the reason we met each other. And I think she's a brilliant leader. And it must help. I mean, I don't work within, they're a client of ours, but I don't work within their organisation. But from everything I've heard, it must help to bring those more feminine qualities or personality traits to the very top, because I think we're agreed anyway. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I think we're agreed that women tend to be, on a general scale, more empathetic, a little bit more caring, a little bit more nurturing of people, maybe a little bit better at understanding how the other person's feeling, potentially. And again, I can give you a great example of when this happened to me, and it happened to be a man. And obviously, so there was a round of promotions. I didn't get one. I didn't actually go for it, but it was a round of promotions. And one of the senior leaders came over to me and said, "Can I have a word?" I said, "You're doing really well. Don't feel..." And I was thinking, wow, that's amazing that you even thought that I would be disappointed about that, because it wasn't like I went for a job and didn't get it. And so I thought that was brilliant. But generally speaking, I think women tend to have... well, actually, let me ask you the question, because that's another thing that came out of the an interview I saw with Jordan Peterson, where he said that women, again, it's a generalization and every human is unique, and I'm not trying to stereotype anybody, but just to have an open conversation. But women tend to care about people more than men do on a general level, and men care about things more than women do. And so if I take that to household of four, me, Karen, and the kids. I love my Apple phone and my gadgets and the car and stuff like that. And Karen couldn't care less about that stuff, right? She's like, I need it because I need it for work, but I don't care what model it is or what flashy camera pixels it's got or anything like that. And I do, right?
Yeah.
But that's a really small sample size. But would you agree that at a general level is the case?
Yeah, it definitely. And again, there's really interesting, we go back far enough, there's fascinating studies happening now into kind of in prehistory and really early history. How natural are those gender differences and how far have they been things that have been created? So people have unearthed ancient tombs and looked at kind of bones and burial sites and a whole bunch of things. And there's a body of evidence that's showing that actually if we go back far enough, there weren't the same kind of gender differences naturally that women would fight as well. The size difference wasn't as great. The bone density was the same. So if we go back far enough, there's not that much difference. But absolutely, because of years of social conditioning, we are definitely in a stage now where women tend to over-index on a lot of those qualities. And men, I think the really important thing is men have those qualities as well. There are a lot of men who are brilliant at, empathy, emotional intelligence, nurturing, caring, and who are interested in people, not just things. But again, overlapping distributions mean there is definitely that tendency. And that's why, again, there's some really fascinating ways that it manifests that I think if we get sort of quite practical, because it's so easy to get fascinated by the scale of this stuff. But if you go really practically in the comms industry or in business generally, one of the ways that manifests is men tend to have a different conversational model to women, which is really interesting, which is men will often have what's called shoulder-to-shoulder conversations, whereas women tend to have more face-to-face conversations.
I must tell you, because I thought about you on Tuesday evening. I coach an under-7s football team, and the Angel, my assistant, and I went for a pint afterwards, and the Liverpool game was on telly, and we were sat side by side on a bench with a pint each, looking at the phone, talking to each other, and I thought, oh my goodness, this is what Laurie's talking about.
Exactly. So side-by-side conversations, and there's often a thing that you're talking about. So the classic is two guys sitting next to each other in a bar with a pint watching the football or something. That's how men feel more comfortable talking. That's got interesting implications for instance, therapy. So we know mental health is a kind of big issue for men, and they're much less likely to seek help for it. Again, there's some interesting kind of conversations going on around therapy that say one of the problems might be that the therapist model imposes a conversational model on men that they're not comfortable with in any regard. And then, so that may just make an additional extra barrier. So there's all kinds of therapists going, how do we design therapy for men in a way that meets them where they are and starts with side-by-side conversations while you're doing something, rather than trying to impose the more feminine model on that conversation, which is generally a model of, are we further together or further apart or closer together? How are we understanding each other?
Yeah. That's
a natural model. And fascinatingly, I think for comms as well, that even plays out in things like humour. So if you understand banter is a very masculine coded conversational model. And that's because it's often about kind of sitting side by side, looking at something. Often it also has this kind of who's up, who's down, who's winning, who's losing, that we code boys to be competitive, that who's alpha, who's beta, that even manifests in like the way we think about humour, where a more feminine coded humour might, for instance, be something like Ted Lasso, I think is a brilliant example, or Schitt's Creek, or some of those kind of big Emmy award-winning shows, that not just their subject matter, but the actual conversational model and the kind of humour that they use is technically more feminine coded than more masculine. And we don't see as much of that as we could. It's a huge opportunity for brands and content creators and advertising creatives to lean into some of that.
Yeah. Well, if I go to the opposite end of that spectrum, I've mentioned Jordan Peterson a few times. Andrew Tate, possibly the polar opposite of what you've just explained there. But he's getting huge audiences of young men who are feeling a little bit, not worthless, but a little bit sort of disenfranchised, and they don't really know what their place is in the world anymore. What's your thoughts or your findings through the sort of study for the book?
Yeah.
On that?
So it is, and it's impossible to have a conversation about gender without Andrew Tate coming up. And there are a few things that I think are really important. And again, I'll tell you what's my opinion and what's the data showing. So my opinion that I believe very strongly is that I said I studied law. I'm a very firm believer in do not comment on his legal situation at all, because I'm a very firm believer in that we must uphold the principle that somebody is innocent until proven guilty. So I'm not going to have trial by media. I just go, what any of us can think is up to us, but I'm not going to get drawn into, is he guilty of the crimes or not?
Sure.
I'm going to leave that to the courts. The court system is problematic, but again, I'm just going to park that for a minute. So what I will talk about is what's the kind of cultural impact of him and his content. And I think you're right, there's two things. So what's he's most famous for, I guess, is his misogyny, right? And one thing that's really important, I think, for us to understand about that is that most of the men who follow Andrew Tate don't go there for the misogyny. They end up being radicalized by the content that he creates and by the algorithms that serve it up. And as you said, what a lot of the men who I talk to who will kind of skirt around and consume what's often referred to as the manosphere, they're going there for a couple of really important reasons. One is they go, I want to get on in life. I want to be able to, I've got ambitions and I don't really know how to get on in life. And it feels like it can be quite difficult, especially if you're a straight white man, to even say that out loud sometimes, because people are telling me that I've got too much privilege and straight white men have had an unfair advantage for too long. So part of what's driving them is like a professional, how do I thrive professionally? Part of what's driving them is a desire to be, if they're straight, how do I get a girl? How do I be what girls want me to be? So I always say to people that the questions that are driving men are fundamentally reasonable, positive. They're the same questions that we all ask of ourselves. Like, how do I get on? How do I thrive socially, professionally, romantically, whatever it might be? Now, the answers he gives men are horrific, in my opinion. And there's a lot of data that says quite how they're horrific. The thing that we don't talk about enough, so we talk a lot about how horrific his misogyny is and the very, very real impact it has, as well as the world of pornography, which is like a million miles away from where pornography was for anyone of my generation. The lack of consent, the aggression, the abuse that is being kind of normalized and consumed by really young boys and girls. There's a load of stuff going on that's like really damaging to women and girls. And, sort of sex crime, sexual abuse, it's a horrific problem, way bigger than most people think it is. But the thing that gets talked about even less is the impact of what Tate sells on men themselves. So they are being radicalized, not just into misogyny, but also into a kind of vision of the world that is back to that thing I just talked about. It's like a pyramid. It's like the Hunger Games is what we're selling men and boys. And we have done for centuries. It's like there's life is a rat race. You have to compete with everybody else. You need to get up. You need to push other people down in order to get there. And the competition in life is to get as close to the top of the pyramid as you can. And the only way to do that is to fight other people, literally or metaphorically, to kind of get yourself up to the top. And when you look at it through that lens, interestingly, the misogyny is almost like collateral damage and trophies in this project of masculinity, which is what Trump's actually pushing, which is, are you the top G or not? Are you the alpha or are you beta? Are you a simp? Tate. Sorry. Yeah. Oh, my God.
This is 2 days after Trump just got made president again, so I'm sure we'll come on to him next.
Sorry, yeah. And Tate is like the tip of a very big iceberg. But what those guys are selling is really damaging men as well, because it is selling this idea that women are either something that you possess and can abuse, or that you possess but become your kind of trophies for success in life. And what matters in life is you defeating other men or looking impressive to other men. And that's really unhelpful because it does a ton of damage to a lot of boys' mental health, their social skills, their ability to admit vulnerability, their ability to help each other and connect. And again, when we go back to all that stuff where we say men aren't already great at being able to kind of talk to each other and go, how are you doing? How are you actually feeling? Are you really okay? And it ignores the fact that actually to really thrive, we all need to work together. So life is not a zero-sum game. And again, this bit is not my opinion. There's a huge amount of data that says the more we collaborate, particularly across genders, in relationships, in businesses, in societies, at state level, at national level, the more gender equal we are, and the more gender balanced we are, the happier everyone is, the healthier everyone is, and the better off everybody is. So what Tate is selling men is damaging men as much as it's damaging women.
Yeah, for sure. So how do we change men then and boys? Because you're right, men don't seem to, and again, it's a generalization, but men don't tend to open up about the bad things that are going on in their life. Everyone has challenges. They tend not to talk to too many other people about that. They just kind of cross the bear, off we go. How are you? I'm fine. Yeah, you're right. Yeah, I'm good. Yeah, not too bad. Yeah, and that's the end of it. And then let's talk about what the football match is, or what's going on in sport, or something else. And if you're a young man or a boy and you're seeing Andrew Tate, and that's probably the best advice you're getting, because you're not asking anybody else about anything. So you're finding your way through social media, and you've got people like that you're basically listening to. You're probably spending more time. You've probably got more face time with Andrew Tate than you have with your dad in terms of proper, real conversations. Yeah. How do we change that? How do we get boys and men to open up and talk more?
Yeah. So I think there's a few things. One is we need to give them some better answers to the questions than the likes of Tate are serving up. So I think there's a massive opportunity. In a vacuum, the bad agents will fill that space, and he's doing brilliantly. And he is a brilliant marketer as well. He's got a brilliant business model. He's very good at kind of knowing how to sell it. But there's very few people who are offering an alternative. So I think the first thing is anybody who makes content, thinks about audiences, we need to create stuff that answers those really legitimate questions that men have about how do I thrive professionally, socially, romantically, sexually, gives them better, more positive answers than Tate, because it's much easier to give something as an alternative than it is to say, don't do that. I think a second thing is, and this goes back to some of those kind of superiority myths that we were talking about, we need to position some of the things at the moment that men and boys aren't doing as gains and not losses. And what I mean by that, even language is fascinating. A lot of the time, what men are hearing is that women want to emasculate men. They want to teach them to be more like women. And they see that as a loss. They see it as a lack. It's like we are being curtailed, and all these wonderful things about who we are that we want to feel proud about, we're being told that they're evil and that they're bad, and that we've got to be more like women. Now, importantly, if we go back to those conversations we had where we immediately see things like empathy and vulnerability and softness as inferior to toughness, to confidence, to aggression, to fighting, it's no wonder men are hearing what we're selling them is, can you please be a bit inferior in your worldview, because we're trying to take away the thing that you see as powerful and turn you into something else. Now, I think that's fascinating, because that's not how feminism felt for women over generations. What women felt, and again, if you make it really kind of practical, you go, most of the time, most people that I've talked to and most studies that exist, you go, if a little girl starts playing football, most people will go, that's really cool. That's great. Go her. Yes, she should be allowed to do that. That's brilliant. And girls being able to take part in things that were traditionally seen as masculine coded, we all kind of go, that's brilliant. Partly that's because she's not having to do that instead. She's allowed to be, doing gymnastics and football. But it's also because in that instance, we value football much more than we value gymnastics. So we go, oh, great, she's doing superior stuff, and we should allow girls to do that. Now, when you look at it the other way round and go, if a boy wants to do gymnastics or wants to do ice dance or wants to do ballet, those things that are coded feminine, even though boys do them as well, we see that as a kind of inferior thing as a society. I'm not talking about you and me. And in an incredibly deep-rooted way. So it feels like what we're selling men is, A, please can you change and be ashamed of the things that you are, and B, we're trying to sell you something that you think is inferior.
Right.
So that's a real problem. What we need to do is two things, I think.
Going back to your advertising strategy brief then.
Exactly. So what we do there is, one is we need to go with the flow, start with where men are. And instead of telling them that they need to change, we use some of the things that they're already proud of, but slightly redirect those. So one, for instance, I kind of go slightly jokingly. I started off by kind of going, actually, this is a really interesting thing. As I started interviewing men, as I did for the book, because a lot of the book is a qualitative kind of debrief of my conversations with men. The idea that, first of all, that empathy is a really valuable thing. So if men have been coded all their lives to see life as a competition, telling them not to be competitive and making them ashamed of their competitiveness is not going to be effective. Right? We can talk about what's right separately, if you like, but I'm like, how do we make things effective? So I would go, the advertising strategy would be, okay, how do you use competitiveness, but slightly redirect it? So I was like, right, imagine if empathy was like an Olympic sport, men would suddenly be brilliant at it, most of them, because you've immediately kind of, you gamify it, you reward it, you work with the things that men are already tend to over-index in and are proud of. Because I think giving men things to be proud of is really helpful. And at the moment, a lot of what they're hearing, even if it's not always what we're saying, is you should be ashamed of all the things that are kind of coded masculine. Another example is protectiveness. So again, I spend a lot of time following things that a woman and a person of my generation wouldn't normally follow, because I think it's really important to understand, get out of the echo chamber that I'm in. But protectiveness is something that's a really powerful motivator for men. They want to protect. Now, meanwhile, the other part of the world that I live in more naturally, a lot of women are going, do you know what, dude? It's men are spending a lot of time trying to protect women without noticing that the thing that you're trying to protect us from is you. Not you personally, again, each man, but the biggest threat to women's safety is actually other men. Now, men then hear that as an attack, and it's just like, oh my God, you've chosen the bear rather than me, you must hate me, all that kind of stuff.
For those that don't know, the bear rather than me.
Yeah, so this is a thing that was huge on social media, where somebody asked somebody, would you rather be, if you had to choose between you're alone in the woods with a bear or with a man that you don't know, which would you choose? And a phenomenal amount of women choose the bear. There's a whole bunch of reasons why they do that, but for the purpose of this conversation, I think what's really fascinating...
It wasn't Paddington Bear, was it?
It wasn't no. Paddington Bear, no. And you weren't allowed to ask any qualifying questions.
I see, right, okay.
But I think there's two things. One is that men vastly underestimate and don't realise just how much danger women are in as the result of the behaviours of some men. It's not the majority of men, but the majority of sexual offences, the majority of harm that is done to women is performed by men. And again, it's really important to go, it's not the majority of men, but it's way over 90% of sex crime, etc., violent crime, whether the victim is male or female, is committed by men. But so women want to be protected. Well, they want to be safer, rather. And what women tend to be saying is, if a guy really wants to protect us, can you protect us from the men who are causing us harm? Men, meanwhile, are saying the role of protector is something I feel really kind of proud of, and that's a valuable thing. But they're not sure how to direct that, because they hear all this stuff going on about men being much more likely to be perpetrators of abuse, feel that sort of feels like an accusation. We haven't taught men and women to have better conversations about it. And so I go, one of the things we can do in a very practical sense is, how do we teach men how to use some of those protective instincts that they have, but use them to kind of fight back against the likes of Andrew Tate, rather than trying to fight back against feminism, because it's not feminism that's actually causing the problems. Yeah. So it's that kind of thing, just redirecting the things that men are proud of or want to be proud of, but redirecting them in a way that is actually positive and useful for all of us. Okay.
And so then, just bringing it back, I feel like I could speak to you for another 2 hours at least, but we have other things to do, sadly. So bringing it back to our industry then, I think we both agree that as an industry, we've done quite well at putting women in the most senior role, which has to help, right? It has to help. You don't have to, but it's much easier to be something if you've seen it, like, right? So like the 5-minute mile or 4-minute mile, whatever it was, nobody thought it was possible. It can't be done. It's done once and then loads of people do it. Yeah. And so women as CEO is quite, I don't know what the numbers are, you probably do, but it seems that across media agencies and media owners, there's a lot of women, female CEOs, which is good, right?
Yeah, not as many as we think, interestingly.
Is that right?
Again, back to that point about the kind of the 30%. So we tend to generally assume that when about 30% of any industry or board or exec or whatever is female, we tend to think that that's kind of pretty much there, almost 50-50. Part of that is things like the 30% club existed for ages. But we tend to read it as almost half and half, where actually men are still, another way of cutting that data is men still tend to outnumber women about 2-1 in most, like in average across the industry. There are pockets where actually there's more women than men. There are others where women are virtually nowhere. Across the industry as a whole is about 17% at the moment when we look at kind of advertising, comms, marketing, brands and media owners. Right. But in advertising, in agency land, it's generally a bit better. Media and creative, it's, I think, 30-something, the figure.
Okay.
Yeah. But you know, we've come a long way over the years, for sure.
And I know a lot of the things that you talk about are trying to give people ideas or practical things that they can actually put into place. So maybe we could finish with a little bit of advice of what individuals can do, whether they be men or women, and what organisations can do to perhaps kind of help us move in the right direction.
Yeah. So there's one thing I think that's really helpful. Well, I know actually two things. One thing I'm going to say, look at the actual data, because again, back to our point about in any industry, in any company, it's really easy for us to think we know what the picture is, and then actually to get proper robust data is just enormously helpful to know whether you are in a company or in a sector where women are making up the majority of the promotions or the majority of the people on the board, or the minority, or something in between. And again, just be aware that sometimes, a lot of the time, we tend to think we've come further than we have. So that's the first thing. But the really practical thing you can do, there's a guy called Thomas Chameroy-Premuzic, who I absolutely love, who's an academic, and he does a lot of work around leadership qualities. What are the most effective ones, and how does that play out across different genders? And again, this comes back to a theme we've been talking about quite a lot. So what he finds in his data is that a whole bunch of those things that we talked about earlier are proven to be the most effective leadership qualities. So things like emotional intelligence and empathy, something he calls coachability, which is the instinct to go, hang on a minute, maybe I'm not perfect. What have I missed? Is that right? Which we often code as like self-doubt or imposter syndrome. And actually, it's an incredibly valuable leadership quality. Curiosity. Like every screw up in the history of the world has probably been preceded by someone being overconfident, going, no, I've got this. So those things can be incredibly valuable. Collaboration, having a clear kind of vision that you can rally people around and kind of get a team feeling like they want to work together. All of those. So he's kind of mapped out what are the most effective leadership qualities according to the data. And then he says, fascinatingly, if we were to promote as a pure meritocracy just on the quality of those characteristics, 70% of leaders right now would be women, because, as we said before, women tend to over-index in those things, maybe slightly for biological reasons, but mostly probably because of social conditioning. Now, I think there's a couple of really important things about that. One is that 30% of those would be men. And I would go, if we can have more men in leadership, being men who display those qualities, that would be super helpful. And not all women display those qualities. So again, sometimes I get torn apart by trolls for daring to say that not every woman in leadership is someone who embodies those more feminine coded qualities that are incredibly effective. I've
known women in the industry that would be quite the opposite of that. You would say the harridan and the ball breaker. I think you'd refer to them as like quite masculine in their sort of personality traits.
Yeah, and like I grew up in the era of Thatcher. I was a kind of young girl in the era of Thatcher. And if you look at, organisations like the Met Police, Cressida Dick was the leader at a time where, when you look at the report of the institutionalised misogyny as well as racism, homophobia, you are not guaranteed to have a thriving culture just by having a woman CEO. It depends what qualities and values she brings. But I go, there's a really simple answer to a lot of these problems when it comes to leadership, where I go, if you promote people according to those proven effective leadership qualities, you are going to solve a whole load of problems all at once. You're going to get a better gender balance because right now, because of the way we code gender into people and behaviour into people, women over-index in those qualities, right? You're also going to get more effective leadership because you are promoting on the basis of the most effective leadership qualities. But something else really important happens as well, which is you give men a vision of what they can do to thrive and to get promoted and to do well. Because what we're saying to men is not, you're discounted from this conversation just because you're a man. What we're saying is, if you're a man who wants to thrive in a really effective business and in society the way that it is now, here's what you need to do. You need to really be proud of and develop your emotional intelligence, your ability to kind of have self-doubt and to ask other people in, to collaborate. If you do all of those things, that's how you can thrive. And it stops it being, right back to where we started, this kind of Menemies mindset where we're like, we've got a little piece of pie, we've got to share it out, and then we need to get more women in there, and then the men feel disgruntled because they feel like they don't even have a chance. And then the likes of Tate can take that and use it and kind of weaponize that as if women are the enemy. And men are assuming that the women who get there are only there because they've been given a free pass just because they're a woman. And meanwhile, the women are furious because they know there's all kinds of barriers they needed to overcome, that they've had to work even harder than most men have to get to that position. You just get past all of that by going, this is what great leadership looks like. Right now, women over-index in those qualities. So let's start teaching boys to be prouder of those qualities and better at that stuff, because it's really valuable. And let's encourage that in our leaders. Let's promote for that and let's reward that. And you'd suddenly make a huge difference.
And I said that was the last thing, but maybe one last thing that came to my mind there. How is WACL helping with that? Because I know you and Karen Stacy are like heavily involved in WACL. So what's the sort of mission for WACL and how you're helping sort of the women in our industry, but perhaps both genders?
Yeah, so it's a great question. And what we go, our ambition is to have 50% of CEOs across every bit of the industry, all of the different sectors, to be women. So it's kind of proportionate to the population. And importantly, within that we reflect the full diversity of women, because we know, again, women who look like me get disproportionate advantage and a lot less systemic barriers than women who, you know, may walk around in a less white and middle class body and life. So that's what we're trying to get to. But one of the things that we've got 5 levers of change that we talk about. And the first one we call new language of leadership. And that is exactly these kind of things that I've been talking about. So where until very recently, and still in most businesses, we tend to assume that the model of what great leadership looks like is one that's based on a whole load of assumptions from the past and a whole load of language about kind of being ballsy and being tough and being a killer. And that's not what makes the most effective leadership. And it prioritizes masculine qualities, and it makes it more likely for us to promote men into those positions who don't have the most effective qualities. And it makes us more likely to either encourage those in women, which is not what we're wanting to be doing, or to penalise women for either not having it or having too much of it. So that's our first pillar. Our first lever of change is new language of leadership. The other really important thing to say is there are other kind of systemic things that we need to address. So promote for potential is one, where we go, at the moment we have a system where people women, for instance, are much more likely to be the ones who take time off their career to be the primary carer. That creates a leadership and pay gap, which is then exacerbated as we go through life, because when women do come back to work, we tend to promote and pay people based on what they did previously. And so as soon as you start doing that, you're exacerbating a divide that already exists, and it never really closes. We also look at things like be a women's health hero, because women's bodies are different from men's, and that doesn't that doesn't mean we're sort of less able. It just means that actually in some ways there are superpowers about that, but we need to take account for things like periods and endometriosis and menopause, and just make sure that those aren't creating unnecessary barriers for women. Flexible working's another one. And then creating, we say work like the world is watching, which is about kind of creating safe cultures where people can kind of be themselves without having to face, things like sexual harassment. So we do Time 2 is an industry initiative that we help to set up along with Represent Me, which is another part of our work that kind of goes, the industry has a disproportionate power to affect change. And this is where I love to end on this, because I think it's where sort of Wackle and my work come together again in all kinds of ways as well. But there's a lot to change, right? We could talk for hours about it. We've barely scratched the surface. And sometimes that can feel really overwhelming. But I think what's really interesting, if we adopt an every little helps strategy, right? Every single bit of content we create, every product and service that we sell, every kind of piece of tech that we develop, every conversation that we have is an opportunity to do it in a way that creates a better economy, business, society, relationships for men as well as women, and to solve all of these problems. So like every single one of these things is an opportunity for businesses and brands and content makers to do things better. And the data is all really, really clear that if we do that, businesses get a competitive advantage. So
fabulous. I've really enjoyed this, and I wish we had longer because, as you say, we've just scratched the surface. The book, for those watching, I'm going to hold it up, No More Menemies. I'm going to read it. I haven't yet. I apologise, but I only found out about it a week ago, so I think I could be excused.
I always feel like an English teacher again when people are apologising for not
sorry, miss. Sorry, miss. Please don't write "see me" in my book. But thank you so much for your time. It's been a really lovely conversation, and thanks for being on the podcast.
I appreciate it.